Thanks, everyone. It's an immense pleasure for me to be here in Fukuoka. And so today I'll talk to you about Chinese characters, more specifically traditional Chinese characters, and how I believe that they are the key to learning multiple Asian languages, especially from East Asia. Okay, so to start this presentation, I would like to ask you if you know what this map represents. Yes, that is correct. So that is a map of what is called the Sinosphere. And the Sinosphere is basically the region of the world in which China has historically had a very strong cultural and linguistic influence. So what happened is that over the centuries, Chinese characters and many words of Chinese origin were imported into Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And a consequence of that is that there are now a large proportion of words of Chinese origin in the vocabularies of Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. So they make up about 60% of the Japanese vocabulary, 2/3 of the Korean vocabulary, and I've read that they make up 1/3 of the Vietnamese vocabulary, but apparently this figure is debatable. Some people say it's much higher. And a direct consequence of this is that there are now many common words between Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And one example is this word. So it means economy or economics. And so it's pronounced 经济 in Mandarin, but you can also pronounce it in different ways in other regional Chinese languages, such as here in Cantonese. It's pronounced 経済 in Japanese, Gyeongche in Korean, and it also has a different pronunciation in Vietnamese. So I'm not going to attempt the Cantonese and Vietnamese pronunciation because unfortunately I do not speak these languages. I can only speak Mandarin, Japanese and Korean. But what I'm telling you about all this is valid for basically all languages from the Sinosphere region. Okay, so there are a couple of other examples, of course. So this word, which means all or everything. So you can read it 全部 in Mandarin. This is how you read it in Cantonese. It's 全部 in Japanese, 全部 in Korean, and that's how you read it in Vietnamese. And one last example, obviously this word that you all know, which means Chinese character. So you can read it 汉字 in Mandarin. That's how you read it in Cantonese. Kanji in Japanese, hanja in Korean, and that's how you read it in Vietnamese. Okay, so you basically get the idea. And in fact, up to the 19th century, the same Chinese characters were used to write words of Chinese origin in all Sinosphere languages. So that means that basically any literate person in the Sinosphere would have been able to read any word of Chinese origin in any language from that region. Pretty convenient for us, for polyglots. You just had to learn one language, and then you would know how to learn a lot of words in other languages. Unfortunately, this is no longer the case. And why is that? What happened exactly? Well, from the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of language reforms in the Sinosphere. There were not only Chinese character simplification reforms in China and in Japan, but also Chinese character elimination reforms in Korea and in Vietnam. So now I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of all these reforms, starting with the simplification of Chinese characters in China. So the first ideas to simplify Chinese characters came about during what is called the New Culture movement. It's an intellectual movement, basically, that started right after the overthrow of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of the Republic of China. And back then, a lot of intellectuals and scholars were basically brainstorming on ideas how to make China a better country, how to reform the countries. They were very skeptical of traditional Chinese cultures and traditional Chinese values, such as Confucianism. And at the same time, they wanted to introduce new ideas. And one of these ideas was that Chinese characters were too complex and that they were preventing China from developing. And they thought that simplifying Chinese character was the right way to go back in the days. Some scholars even wanted to get rid of Chinese characters altogether. But the first attempt to officially simplify Chinese characters happened a little bit later, in 1935, during the Republican era. And at that time, a list of about 300 simplified characters was released by the Chinese government, by the Republican government at the time. They were made kind of co-official alongside traditional characters, as a kind of pilot project, as we would say nowadays. But the thing is, it was a very controversial measure, heavily criticized by scholars and by government officials. So it was withdrawn less than 1 year after its introduction in 1936. Now, the modern simplified characters that we know nowadays are the fruit of measures taken by the People's Republic of China government that took over the mainland of China after the Chinese Civil War in 1949, sorry. And these measures were implemented by a series of reforms in the 1950s and the 1960s. And this is a little bit what happened to Chinese characters. So some of them were merged with Chinese characters that have the same sound. Some others were simplified based on their cursive forms. Others were simplified by replacing some of their components by simple symbols. Some others were simplified by only simplifying one of their components, so the component on the left here. Others were simplified by completely removing components, such as this character. Sometimes you had simplifications when you only would keep the outline of the character in the simplified form. In some other characters, you would replace some components by a simpler phonetic component. And last but not least, some characters were replaced by ancient popular variants that had fallen out of use, such as the character for country. Okay, so because of all these reforms, there are now two sets of Chinese characters in use in the Chinese-speaking world. So you've probably heard of simplified characters and traditional characters, right? But you might not know exactly what they correspond to and where they're used, so I'd like to clarify this a little bit for you. So simplified Chinese characters is the name given to Chinese characters resulting from the simplification reforms I just told you. They are now used officially in mainland China and in Singapore, and they are called 简体字 in Chinese. Now, on the other hand, traditional characters is the term that is given to the original form of Chinese characters, so before all these simplification reforms. They are still used in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, and in many overseas Chinese communities. And nobody agrees on what to call them in Chinese. So if you go to mainland China, they're going to be called 繁体字, which literally means complex form characters. So it kind of has a negative connotation, like, oh, these characters are too complex, just learn simplified characters. On the other hand, if you go to Taiwan, they're called 正体字, which means proper characters. So here again, you have a connotation against a simplified character. So we use the proper characters, not the simplified one. And fortunately, there is another term which is not used that much in the Chinese-speaking world. It's 全体字, which means full-form characters. And I like this term the best because it's the least biased. You know, it's the most neutral. All right. So now let's move on to the Chinese character simplification reforms in Japan. So starting from the Meiji era, at the end of the 19th century, basically, there were several debates that took place to modernize the written form of the Japanese language in Japan. And this issue is known as the national language and script problem, so kokugo kokuji mondai in Japanese. And what happened is that Japanese scholars made several proposals to simplify the Japanese script. So some scholars wanted to simplify the forms of kanji. So remember that kanji is the Japanese name given to Chinese characters. So simplify the forms of kanji and limit the number of kanji in official use. Some others wanted to abandon kanji and write Japanese exclusively in kana. So kana is the Japanese phonetic writing system. And others wanted to completely get rid of kanji and kana and just switch to a phonetic writing system to write Japanese, so to use the Roman alphabet. And in the end, the first group, so to speak, won because a new official list of kanji was published by the Japanese government in 1946. So this list, it used to be called the Toyo kanji list. Now it's called the Joyo kanji list. So if you're learning Japanese, you've probably heard of it. And in this list, a lot of Chinese characters had simplified forms. So they're called shinjitai in Japanese, which literally means new character forms. And what happened to these characters was kind of similar to what happened to simplified Chinese characters. So some characters were simplified by using ancient popular variants. Some characters were simplified based on their cursive form. In some other characters, you had some component removed. And in some other characters, you had some components that were simplified. But that's not all, because in 1956, so 10 years later, another reform was promulgated to ensure that common Japanese vocabulary could be written only using kanji from this official list, from the Toyo kanji list. And this reform is called the Doon no kanji ni yoru kakikai, which literally means in Japanese, rewriting according to kanji having the same sound. Because this is basically exactly what happened. So they took, for words that used kanji that are not in the Joyo kanji list or in the Toyo kanji list back in the days, they basically took a phonetic equivalent regardless of its meaning. So they replaced kanji that actually had meaning by phonetic equivalents that are in the Toyo kanji list. All right, so one question that you might have right now is, were the same simplifications used both in China and Japan? And the answer is, of course not. That would have been too easy, right? So in many cases, Chinese characters were simply not simplified, either in neither in Japanese nor in Chinese. In some rare cases, you have the same simplification in Chinese and in Japanese, such as for the Chinese character for country. But in most cases, it was done differently. So sometimes it was simplified in Chinese only, sometimes in Japanese only, and most of the time you have different simplifications in Chinese and in Japanese. And if you examine some of these simplifications, like this character, for example, you will see that the character is only partially simplified in Japanese, but a lot more drastically simplified in Chinese. Okay, so that was it for the simplification of Chinese characters. Now let's talk about Chinese characters elimination reforms, starting with Korea. So as you may not know, before World War II, Korean used to be written in what is called the Hangul Hanja mixed script. It's also called the Korean mixed script. And in Korean mixed script, you would have written Sino-Korean words in Hanja. So remember that Hanja are the name given to Chinese characters in Korean. And all the rest in Hangul. So Hangul are like the phonetic writing system of Korean. So the sentence, I have a friend studying engineering in China, would have been written like this. 중국에서 공학을 공부하는 친구가 있어요. But Hanja were completely removed from the writing system of Korean after World War II. And this was done by separate reforms in North Korea and South Korea. So it happened in 1948, right after World War II in North Korea, and at the end of the 1960s in South Korea. So the sentence that I just showed you, that used to be written like this, is now written like this, completely using Hangul, even for Korean words of Chinese origin, so Sino-Korean words. Okay, so last but not least, let's talk about the Chinese character elimination reforms in Vietnam, because up to the 19th century, Vietnamese was written using a writing system that is called Chu Nom. And in this writing system, you would have written Sino-Vietnamese words, so Vietnamese words of Chinese origin using existing Chinese characters, so borrowed from Chinese, from China or from Chinese, and native Vietnamese words were written using Chinese characters invented by the Vietnamese themselves, so locally invented. So the sentence, "My mother eats vegetarian food at the pagoda every Sunday," would have been written like this. So in green, you have Chinese characters that come from Chinese, that were borrowed. And in brown, you have Chinese characters that were invented by the Vietnamese. Unfortunately, in the late 19th century, so during the French colonial period, the Ternon writing system was replaced by the Vietnamese alphabet, which is a writing system based on the Roman alphabet. So the sentence I just showed you, which used to be written like this, is now written like that. So completely using a phonetic writing system. Okay, so now that you've had a good overview of all these reforms, more or less, I'd like to talk about some issues that were introduced by these reforms. And if we talk about issues with the Chinese character simplification reforms, one of the main problems is that they make it harder to understand what Chinese characters are supposed to represent. So for example, if you take the character for to fly, whose traditional form is this one, so it's comprised of two wings, plus a symbol that means to ascend. Well, it's been simplified to this character in China. So you basically only have one wing to represent the concept of flying. It's pretty difficult to fly with one wing. And the Chinese character that means to sell is comprised of the character that means to buy, plus a symbol that means to go out. And in Japan, it was simplified to this form. So you basically can't see the connection between the action of buying and selling any longer, sadly. Now, if we talk about the issues with the Chinese character elimination reforms in Korea and in Vietnam, the main problem is that you lose the etymology of words of Chinese origin when you do that. So when you write a word of Chinese characters, you can instantly see what each syllable corresponds to. So, for example, the word 친구 in Korean for friend is comprised of the character intimate and of the character for all times. So to Koreans, a friend is basically someone you've had an intimate relationship for a long time. Makes a lot of sense, right? But now it's spelled like this, completely phonetically, so you don't really see at first glance what each syllable means. So you have to actually look it up in a dictionary to understand that. Of course, it also applies to Vietnamese. So if I took the Vietnamese words for politics, that's composed of the kanji for, the Chinese character for the government and the Chinese character for rule. Because politics basically corresponds to the concept of the administration of a government. It's now spelled like this, so completely phonetically, and you have no idea what each syllable means unless you look it up in a dictionary. But all in all, the main issue with all these reforms is this one. You used to have one single form to write each word of Chinese origin in the Sinosphere, but you now have a simplified Chinese form, a simplified Japanese form, a Korean phonetic form, and a Vietnamese phonetic form. So you now have up to 5 different ways to write the same word. So what is the impact for us for polyglots? Well, if you're going to learn Chinese, and especially Mandarin, there's a very high chance that you're only going to learn simplified Chinese characters for a specific word. Then if you learn Japanese, you're going to learn the Japanese kanjis, the simplified kanji for this word. If you then learn Korean, you're going to learn its Korean phonetic form, and if you then learn Vietnamese, you're going to learn the Vietnamese phonetic form. And as you can see, the connection between these different forms is not really obvious, right? So if you see a word in another language, you might not know that you've already learned it in one of the languages you've already learned, because it's going to have a different form. It's not going to use the same characters. So is there a way to make this connection stronger, so the connection between the common vocabulary of all these languages stronger? And there is, because my advice to you is basically to always learn the traditional Chinese characters associated to each word of Chinese origin. So let's say I'm learning Vietnamese and I come across that word. So if I then look up the traditional Chinese characters for this word, I might then realize that I have already learned it in Mandarin or in Korean or in Japanese. Sorry, yeah, Mandarin, Japanese, Korean. And if I've been diligent enough, then I will have already made the connection to this common form in traditional Chinese characters. And doing this, I will automatically be able to make a connection between all these common forms. Okay, so one question that you might now have is, why can't I just use simplified Chinese characters to do this? I'm only learning simplified Chinese, I don't want to learn traditional characters. The problem is that there were many traditional characters that were sometimes merged into a single simplified character. So for example, the Chinese character in simplified Chinese for empress and for after were merged into the same character, which means empress. And the Chinese character for surface and the Chinese character for noodles were merged into the same Chinese characters for surface, because they're both pronounced mian in Mandarin. So because of this, you're going to end up with a lot of words that will be spelled inconsistently with the etymology in simplified characters. So the spelling that you have in simplified character might be actually different from the spelling in another language that hasn't suffered simplifications. So yeah, if you look up a word that has been simplified based on this principle, and if you try to analyze it, you're not really going to understand what it means. So if I have, so 最后 in Chinese, so most and empress doesn't make any sense, right? But if I look at the traditional form, I can then understand that it's actually most and the character for rear or final. Sorry, for rear or after. So I will then know that it means final or last. You can somehow deduce the meaning. Another example is this. This is what I found at a hotel in Beijing a couple of years back. So, I mean, if you translate each character individually, it kind of makes sense, right? But what was meant here, obviously, is, yeah, 炒意面, so fried noodles. So to avoid these kinds of situations, the best thing to do is to stick to traditional characters when you're learning the common vocabulary of the Sinosphere languages. Okay, so I would now like to show you a couple of tools that will be very useful for you in your learning process. And the first tool is a dictionary called CJKV-Dict that I actually have developed for the polyglot community. So it's available online at cjkv-dict.com. You can use it completely for free. And there is also an app version, so for iOS and Android, that you can download for free. And you have an offline dictionary in it, so you can even use it when you don't have access to the internet. And what you can do with this dictionary is that whenever you search for a word in Chinese characters, you're going to have its definition in Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. So for example, if I search for these two characters, I will get the definition in all 4 languages. I will be able to learn how they're pronounced in Mandarin, Cantonese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and I will be able to see how they're written in simplified characters, so both in Chinese and in Japanese, which is very useful for you if you're learning these 2 languages. Okay, so another useful feature of CJKV-Dict is that it's able to automatically convert simplified characters to traditional characters. So for example, if I enter these 2 characters in the search bar, the dictionary will be able to automatically detect that there is simplified Chinese character form of this word, and the dictionary will then search for the traditional form instead, so that you will not only get the Chinese definition that you would have got anyway with the simplified characters, but you will also get the Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese equivalent words. Another interesting feature is that you can write a word in using its phonetic transcription, so you don't necessarily have to use Chinese characters. And the dictionary will try to match it to existing Chinese characters. So for example, if I write Denwa, then it will automatically detect that it's the kana transcription of these two characters. And I will then get its definition not only for Japanese, but also I'll get the corresponding word in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. Then that means the same thing, or that at least uses the same characters. All right, another tool that I'd like to talk to you about is a tool called the Outlier Dictionary. So the Outlier Dictionary is it's basically a tool that can show you how each Chinese character is built up by kind of taking it apart in functional components. So you can look up the functional components for each character, and this is done according to its etymology. So if you want to know why a Chinese character looks the way it does, then you can use this this tool to figure this out. So it's available as an add-on for the Chinese dictionary app Pleco that you might already know. It's not free, unfortunately. It costs about like $30, I think, for the basic edition, and $60 for the expert edition. And so if you want to know more, you can check out their website. It's outlierlinguistics.com with a hyphen in the middle. Okay, so before I end this presentation and let you ask questions, I'd just like to ask, a common question, which is, how does the future of traditional Chinese characters look like? Can we imagine that the Chinese character simplification and elimination reforms will ever be reversed? So this, of course, is difficult to predict because ultimately it's a political decision and not really a linguistic one. But what we can do in the polyglot community is to raise awareness about the benefits of using traditional Chinese characters to learn multiple Asian languages and to write multiple Asian languages. And one way to do this is to show you a couple of example sentences written in Mandarin, Japanese, and Korean, and to try to compare them a little bit. Okay, so the first example I have for you is what I showed you earlier. So I have a friend studying engineering in China, and this is how you would write it in simplified Chinese, in modern Japanese with simplified characters, with Shinjitai, and in Korean using the Hangul exclusive script, so only in Hangul. So at first glance, you don't really see any commonalities, any similarities between these sentences, except maybe for the word for China, so 中国 in Chinese and 中国 in Japanese. But if you write this sentence in traditional Chinese characters or in the Hangul Hanja mixed script, then you can see that sometimes the same character is used to express the same concept in all three languages. Sometimes some characters are used only in two of these languages or in some of these languages, and sometimes different characters are used to express the same concept. And in other times, you have completely different characters to express the same word. So here you have the word for friend, and here you have the word for studying. So it's used completely different characters in each language. Another example sentence is this one. The Empress was blown away by a typhoon. Yeah, I made the presentation before the typhoon, sorry. So when you have a look at it, at first glance, I mean, you don't really know whether or not you use the same characters. So here you have maybe the same in Chinese and Japanese, but different characters in Korean because you don't know. And it also looks like each language here uses different characters. But in fact, when you write this sentence using traditional characters, well, you can figure out that the same Chinese characters are used to express the same concept in all three languages. Okay, so we are now reaching the end of this presentation, and I really hope that you're interested in the topic of Chinese character simplification and elimination reforms. Now, what I've just told you in this presentation is the tip of the iceberg. So if you want to know more, I recommend you to check out my book. So I've just published a book at the beginning of this year. It's called Traditional Chinese Characters, a Translingual Writing System. And it's available for purchase on Amazon, on these different websites. So Amazon.com, so US, Canada, UK, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, and also in Japan. So now I just have to tell you, 谢谢你们的聆听，ご清聴ありがとうございました。경청 해주셔서 감사합니다. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for the fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
I'm an author of some kanji dictionaries, and I'm deeply involved in this, so everything was extremely interesting. I just want to make a couple of comments on Vietnamese. I've been studying Vietnamese very passionately in the last few years. One correction, the Chu Nom Chu Han, if I'm not mistaken, officially were abandoned in 1942, but actually in the 1920s, not till the end of the 19th century.
Because I know that the colonial French regime has had a very strong influence on that. Basically, they were the ones that, you know, they had a lot of Christian missionaries that said, "Oh, this is too complex. We should write in Roman, using the Roman alphabet."
And another point, you know, as a speaker of Japanese, it's like basically my native language.
Great.
When I study Vietnamese, I always try to learn. I always use a Japanese dictionary that has the Chinese characters. It makes it so much easier to memorize.
I absolutely agree with you.
Even though the pronunciation of Vietnamese is very different from Japanese, it still gives you a very good hint. And one final point, in Glossica, the Vietnamese version of it actually has the Chinese characters for Vietnamese.
That's great.
So when these other languages, Vietnamese, Korean, when they borrow from Chinese and you put them in your tool, do you happen to know how much semantic drift there is? So do you know if the meaning has actually changed at all when it goes into these other languages? Sorry. So often when languages borrow words from other languages, they change a little bit over time. So maybe what used to be telephone is now actually, I don't know, to call.
Yeah. No, it's a very pertinent question. I didn't really talk about this in this presentation, but you have a lot of false friends between like cognates in the Sinosphere. So for example, densha, like densha in Japanese means train, but it means a tram in Chinese, so it's not exactly the same thing. Yeah, sometimes you have like very funny examples, like tegami in Japanese, it's like hand and paper, it means a letter, and it means toilet paper in Chinese, so shouju, it means, right? Because it's paper you can hold in your hand, right? So. And kitte is like, you cut your hand in Chinese, and it's a stamp in Japanese. Yeah.
So your tool only has the original meaning and not the current meaning in the.
I mean, by original, I don't know if it's the original from the ancient Chinese times. Maybe like both meanings have diverged. You know, it happens sometimes. Yeah.
So I think you made the argument, you made the point that one of the things you lose when you move to simplified characters is the fact that the words no longer symbolize what the things are.
Yeah.
So most people, I think, in this room would probably have been speaking as native languages, whatever, first languages, non-hieroglyphic things anyway.
Yeah, of course.
So as someone coming to Chinese or whatever language, as a second language learner, is there arguably like any effect? I mean, arguably no effect, because you can't miss something that you've never had.
No,
I know I'm going against your presentation. I owe you a beer tonight. Sorry.
No. That's not a problem. But the thing is, like, Chinese and Sino-Korean, Sino-Japanese, etc. There are very short words with a very short pronunciation. They're not like Greek words or Latin words with longer syllables and you have, like, from an information theory point of view, you have very little information embedded in the pronunciation. So that's why you need some kind of extra support, And this extra support is the Chinese character, basically.
Two quick questions on. You glossed over the development of or the changes in Korea. I believe there are different timescales for North and South Korea. Could you explain that a bit? And just one more thing. You mentioned that the problems of this process. One thing that seems quite an obvious problem is people lose access to historical text because they can't read them anymore.
Absolutely, yeah.
Could
That's
you
true.
talk about that a bit more? Thanks.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you.
My question is about whether or not you can speak to sort of the origins of katakana and hiragana.
Yeah.
Because I've heard some like stories about one was sort of a women's script, or it was a simplified version, or of like the traditional, Chinese characters for written in Japanese.
Okay, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So, okay, hiragana and katakana were both born out of Chinese characters. So, okay, back in the days, I think it was in the Nara Jidai, the Nara era, they used to write with the Manyo Gana. So, like, like Japanese was basically only written in Chinese characters, used sometimes for their semantic properties, sometimes for their phonetic properties. So you had to guess when to read a Chinese character, like just like a normal kanji nowadays, or like a kana, and it was very messy, right? It was quite difficult. So and what happened is that as a kind of shorthand, so people were switching to a little bit more cursive form, and these cursive forms are basically what became hiragana. And the katakana were used as shorthand, so instead of writing a full character, you would only write like one part of the character. And so yeah, it's not based on cursive, but based on only using one component of the character to write a syllable basically. But yeah, to answer your question about women and men, I think it was more of a fashion thing that women used hiragana and men's katakana, because I think until the end of World War II, right, there was no clear like separation between katakana and hiragana to write Japanese, like we have nowadays, like hiragana for Japanese words and katakana for foreign words. I don't think the separation was that clear back then.
It's still not the case completely.
That's true. Yeah, you can still use either or, like for fashion purposes, or for. Back in the days before the standardization of simplified Chinese characters, so simplified characters are like a standardized writing system, right? An official writing system. Like simplified form of Chinese characters have more or less always existed in Chinese history, but they were never really official. It's like, nowadays in English when you write with W/, it's like an abbreviation. And Chinese people used simplified Chinese characters the same way, as a kind of shorthand, right? But the officialization of simplified characters as the official script of China only started like in the 1950s, 1960s, basically.
The same simplification occurred in Japanese.
Yes, right? Exactly. Exactly.
I think you talked about the future of Chinese characters. Yeah. So I have an important comment on that. Yeah. So in Vietnamese and Korean, the Chinese characters are abandoned. Yeah. In Japanese, they have not been, and they will not be. And there is a very important linguistic reason for that. The Japanese phonological phonetic system is very poor. Yeah. There are only 108 syllables in Japanese. In Chinese, if you count the tones, there are 1,200. In Vietnamese, does anybody know how many syllables are in Vietnamese? Practically no one knows this. We counted it actually, and there are about 7,000. So it's phonetically extremely rich. Now, what happens is in a language that is phonetically poor like Japanese, if you take away the characters, you'll have an enormous amount of homophones.
That is true.
And the language will become intelligible. The only way they can abandon kanji from Japanese is to actually adopt a huge amount of loanwords from English or from some other language. But if you leave them as kango, as Chinese-derived words, they will become incomprehensible, which is the reason why kanji is in Japanese, and it will remain in Japanese, in my opinion.
No, you're right. That's a very valid comment. But, okay, to answer to that, nowadays, Korean is not 100% exempt from that problem, because you still have a lot of homophones in Korean that sometimes can be a little bit problematic. So, and Koreans know this, so what they do is that they write the hanja within brackets after the word directly.
So, start with thank you very much for the wonderful speech. It was really informative.
Thank you.
One quick note that actually kind of follows up what's just been said.
Right.
and that I find interesting is that it's maybe worth noting that while in mainland China, characters were simplified quite drastically. In Korea and Vietnam, they were basically done away with. Whereas in Japan, before characters were simplified, as far as I'm aware, I may be partly incorrect with this, it was in 1900, during that period you mentioned about trouble with the Japanese language, that hiragana was simplified long before kanji ever were, to be one hiragana for each sound, rather than one of various that were created from manual gana.
That is very correct. Okay, I think the word simplified is not the right word here. They were standardized, because before you could have you could have multiple kana to write the same syllable. And what happened is that I think in the 1900s, the Japanese government decided, okay, now we're going to have only one syllable for ka, and all the rest will be like variant forms that we are not going to use anymore. So they're called hentai gana in Japanese.
And not only that, but also if you look at books from around that time, you tend to find that there are kana used to show the pronunciation of almost every kanji.
Oh, okay, like
much
furigana.
More commonly.
Okay.
Whereas now that's almost more of a thing for children's books and such. And so,
or like
sense,
uncommon
Japan
characters,
has almost moved more into the idea, or it seems sometimes that Japan has almost moved more into the idea of using kanji and making sure that everybody knows kanji.
Yeah, definitely.
Which I just find an interesting contrast.
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, it's not really a problem of politics. It's a problem of, it's not a problem of linguistics. It's a problem of politics and education, right? If you have the proper education system, you can teach like any kind of writing system. That's not an issue here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the talk you gave. Something I've been quite interested in myself, starting with Korean and then Chinese and Japanese. It's interesting to see how they're all connected. Because you say they've all been simplified now. But I'm curious about languages like Cantonese and Taiwanese, where they use a mixture of kanji or hanzi with the meaning, and you pronounce it differently. But then they also have characters where there's not really a meaning, but actually just a sound. So a question is, like, how would you go about maybe learning that? And do you think these languages can continue?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So to me, the biggest issue with non-Mandarin languages in China is standardization. That there is no single properly standardized writing system for Cantonese or for Hokkien, etc. And so, I mean, if you really want to be able to write down the language, actually it's very helpful to keep the language going, you know, so to prevent it from dying, like to have a properly standardized written form. And so, to answer your question, I would say, that's what's missing, basically. But Cantonese is okay. I think Cantonese is more or less like 90% standardized. Other languages, a lot less. Because, again, it has to do with politics, you know, Mandarin is the national language, so everyone should speak Mandarin, etc.
Just to touch on the future of Chinese characters in Korea, and then also whether or not one should learn them as a second language learner of Korean. I'm a teacher in a bilingual school, English and Korean.
Oh, great.
And a lot of our elementary school students they have to learn Chinese characters now, and it's coming back.
That's great,
Obviously, it's not going to be fully used, but I mean, in order to have any kind of academic future, you have to know Chinese characters in Korean because of what you mentioned about homophones. And then also to second language learners of Korean, I strongly encourage learning Chinese characters, because if you don't, it's just a lot easier if you know the Chinese characters, and then you can make links to other words when you learn them. And for day-to-day purposes, like, you only need Hangul, but to really learn the language, you have to know
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. If you want to have a deep understanding of Korean, learn Chinese characters, learn Hanja.
As I pass on, let me comment. I find it very hard to read just, like if you read hiragana and katakana only,
right?
It takes adults a long time. If you have the kanji, you can read quickly.
Yeah, it's the same for Korean. It's much easier to pass the text if you have Hanja and Hangul, actually.
Hi, I'm 29 years old Korean.
Great.
I came here to visit this event, and
awesome.
I want to say younger age than me in Korea, they are not studying Chinese character anymore, but they don't have trouble to understand our Korean language or learning other alphabet language from other countries. So personally, I think the elimination of Chinese character in Korea doesn't have problem anymore. So
okay, actually, to answer your question, you know, there was a study from the OECD a couple years back. They looked up at the rates of functional illiteracy in OECD countries, and the level of functional illiteracy in Korea was like amazingly high. Like they didn't really know why. And so functional illiteracy is when you can read, but you don't have a deep understanding of like technical text, for example. So you can't be like functional as a business, as a business person or as a technical person. And so we don't know exactly why this happened, but they strongly suspect that this is because of the elimination of Hanja in the Korean writing system.
We can take one more question.
Yeah.
It's a quick question. It's a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
So, are you planning to expand your CJKV dictionary to other Sinitic languages like Hokkien or Hakka?
Feed me with the database, and yeah. Okay, I need data basically. So yeah, in the first when I was developing this dictionary, initially I only had like 3 languages. I only had like Mandarin, Japanese, and Korean. And then some people asked me, okay, why don't you have Cantonese? Why don't you have Vietnamese? So I expanded it because I was able to find data. So if you know of any like complete database that has Hokkien or Shanghainese or whatever, yeah, please do tell me.
Okay, thank you so much. Good big hand.